Welcome everybody. This is our last session together, your last plenary, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Jim Boyce, who is the director of the Program on Development, Peace Building and Environment at the Political Economic Resource Institute of the University of Massachusetts, and he's written a bunch of books. I think your latest is Economics, the Environment, and the Commonwealth. Is that correct? And he's written. Jim was my teacher. He was a teacher for most of the economists that you see around here. He's written on peace building, environmental justice, environmental economics theory, El Salvador, Costa Rica, the Philippines, Bangladesh, African countries, capital flight. We love him, basically. This guy is our mentor and our friend, and please welcome Jim Boyce.
Well, thanks. Thank you everybody for coming out here on this absolutely beautiful afternoon. I feel bad making you be inside, and so I'll try to be brief and leave plenty of time at the end for Q&A or for people to escape into the sunshine if you prefer that. What I'd like to do is talk about climate policy with a focus on the U.S., although what I'll have to say is by no means unique to the U.S. situation. And before I get going, let me just ask you what you think about one really critical question, which is, why don't we already have a really strong climate policy in the United States? And by that I mean a policy that is really pushing forward in a rapid fashion the transition away from dependence on fossil fuels towards clean and renewable energy. What's the main problem?
Money.
Whose money?
Rich people.
The rich people's money. They don't want to lose those assets.
Yeah, I think that's actually, we've gone straight to the core of onion. It's one of these onion problems, I think. You peel away the layers, and the closer you get to the center, the more you want to cry. And I think right at the center is the vested interests of those who own, or believe they own, or claim they own, the fossil fuel assets that are still in the ground, which are worth, there are various estimates that are floated around, but by some estimates, something in the neighborhood of $30 trillion. And any program that weans the US economy and the other major economies of the world off of fossil fuels is going to make those assets what they call stranded assets. It's not going to be possible to turn them into cash. And the people who've got those assets, or think they've got those assets, I think are going to fight like hell to hang on to that value. And for that reason, I really don't think there's much possibility of designing a policy that's going to win the support or appease the fossil fuel interests, even though that's the strategy that the Democrats have tried in the past. I think in the end, these people are irreconcilable. All right, so that's a critical problem. But on the other hand, the people who own the fossil fuel companies are a relatively small fraction of the population, at least those who have significant amounts of money on the table there. There's a lot of money to be made in developing an alternative energy system, a lot of jobs to be created, a lot of investment to be required. There are economic interests on the other side as well. What is it that is preventing us from winning against them? In a way, your answer tells us who they are, who the problem is, right? But what is it that prevents the rest of us from winning?
We're colluding with them.
Why?
We want the stuff. We use the stuff.
As consumers, we use the fossil fuels. Yeah? Other people have thoughts?
We're really dispersed. We're not our interests aren't aligned.
Yeah, it's partly the people who stand to gain are quite dispersed, the public at large, of course, And in the case of all the jobs, et cetera, that could be created with the clean energy transition, many of the people who benefit from that don't know who they are because the jobs don't yet exist. Whereas the folks who would lose know very well who they are and are out there to actively try to defend their side of the interest scales. What else? When you think about the international climate negotiations going on at these annual summits, the next one will be in Paris in December under the UN negotiating framework. What's the impediment there? Yeah.
Government held hostage by corporate interests who are competing to set agendas which conflict with the preservation of the earth.
I think that's a big piece of it, you know, and in a way that's similar to the rich people answer, right? The corporate interests. So when the governments go to negotiate at the UN fora, to some extent their policies have already been determined or distorted by the interests of corporations that they are close to. That said, there's something else that often comes up in the discussions of these international negotiations as well.
The North-South conflict and the issue of GDP.
Yeah, so an underlying issue that often comes up is the North versus the South, and whether there should be limits on carbon emissions or constraints on carbon emissions in the so-called developing countries of the global South, or whether the limit should only be on the industrialized countries, the already industrialized countries of the so-called global North, based on the principle that A, the countries of the global North are the ones that have really created the problem. If you look at historic responsibility for emitting greenhouse gases, most importantly carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it's the countries of the North that emitted the lion's share of that. Also, the countries of the global North are better off and therefore better able to afford the costs of making the kinds of investments that would move the clean energy transition forward. So for both of those reasons, both for reasons of historic responsibility and for reasons of capacity and income, many would argue that the global North should go first. And indeed, the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change, of which the US is a signatory, it was signed by the first President Bush back in 1992, actually contains explicit language affirming precisely those principles, that countries should act according to their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities. That's a direct quote from the treaty. And so the Kyoto Accord that was signed in 1997 in certain ways embodied that principle by attempting to impose limits on emissions by the global North countries and not on the global South. One of the reasons that George W. Bush gave for ultimately repudiating the Kyoto Treaty, which had never managed to pass the Senate even under Clinton, was that the countries of the global South weren't covered. In particular, he was thinking of China, and he felt it was somehow unfair that the US should incur the costs of cutting emissions while China wouldn't do so. Underlying that particular issue is an assumption, and it's such a common assumption that I would guess not too many people have even thought about it as an assumption. They think about it as a fact, as just a reality, which is that any country that cuts its emissions is going to be bearing a cost. And other countries will receive at least part of the benefit because it's a global public bad, and you know, if we cut our emissions, we'll receive a fraction of the benefits, but the whole world will receive the rest of the benefits, and no one wants to be the one to bear those costs unless others are willing to also bear the costs. So that debate about global North versus global South is premised on the idea that acting to address climate change is going to be costly. And indeed, that's the way most environmentalists have framed the problem. They frame the problem as we in the present generation are being irresponsible, we're damaging the planet, imperiling the climate future, imperiling, therefore, the well-being of future generations of humans as well as other living things, and we need to clean up our act. We need to do the right thing. we need to tighten our belts. We need to bear costs for the benefit of future generations. That's a formula that I think is probably pretty familiar to all of you. The premise is that if we do anything now about climate change, it's going to cost us, right? We're going to have to suffer in order to address this problem. It's going to be, in some sense, bad for us or bad for our economy. And so the debates at these UN fora are all premised on the idea that, no, you go first, no, you go first. No, we need to get a bigger group of countries to all go together because otherwise there's going to be this free rider problem. Some are going to benefit from the reductions of emissions without bearing those upfront costs of reducing them. Right? And what I want to suggest to you today, this is my basic take-home message, is that it's possible to design climate policies that in fact do not impose costs on the majority of people in the current generation. Right now, you and me, here and now, that are not costly, that in fact are beneficial in terms of the two kinds of benefits I'm going to particularly talk about are benefits in terms of public health and benefits in terms of income, in terms of people's purchasing power, people's pocketbooks, right? Benefits to the majority of the people here and now, right? So that it would make sense, for example, for us in the United States to go ahead and institute a climate policy even if the rest of the world wasn't following suit, or we weren't sure they were going to follow suit, because the majority of people in our country, the majority of Americans, would benefit from that policy, here and now. And if you want to think of it this way, the benefits for other people in other countries and for future generations, those would be positive externalities, in a sense, of us doing something that's good for us here and now. You'll appreciate that perspective on the issue is not one that you hear very often. Most of the discussions are premised on the idea that it's going to cost us. Right? And that idea that it's going to cost us is not totally ill-founded. There are certain costs. I don't want to give you the sense that there are no costs involved in addressing the problem. What I want to just suggest is there are also a lot of potential benefits on the table, including benefits that are right here and right now if we choose to seize them. And by designing the policy to reap those benefits and distribute them in a democratic fashion, we can craft a policy that will benefit the majority of people here and now, and thus get us over that particular logjam, a logjam that comes from the notion that this involves tightening our collective belts, and we have to just negotiate about how we're going to share the pain. What I want to suggest is really what we need to be thinking about is how we can share the gain, because there's potentially tremendous gain here and now from implementing such a policy. But we have to know about that. We have to think about it. And I would have to say the environmental community has done a pretty poor job of lifting this up. You know, I mean, one could go into a kind of psychosocial analysis of it, but I think a lot of it stems out of the kind of white Anglo-Saxon Puritan tradition in the United States. For those of you who know about the Jeremiad, which was the most popular literary form in the United States about 200 years ago, these were sermons. One of the most prominent preachers was here in Northampton, Jonathan Edwards, and they had a certain structure. And the structure was, we are sinners. Our sins mean that we are doomed. But if we repent and change our ways, we can arrive at the new millennium. So it's this kind of, collective guilt and punishment and ultimately salvation if you follow the preacher. That's the kind of format that I think is really deeply embedded in the American imagination, the American political psyche. Across classes, across races, it's maybe a little bit stronger amongst the descendants of the white Anglo-Saxon Puritan types, right? And it still has a lot of appeal, especially for elite white environmentalists, right? They kind of like this strategy of making people feel guilty and afraid. That's what it's premised on, this guilt and fear. And I don't think actually in the long run that's a winner, a political winner in the United States. I would submit to you that one of the reasons why we've been at an impasse for so long now in terms of getting a national climate policy in the United States is because the messaging around the issue has been in that old Jeremiah form that gives the message to the majority of the people, this is going to be painful, a painful problem to address. And so the reaction is, well, you know, maybe the science isn't really certain. And you know, I got a lot of pain already, and I got to worry about putting my kids through school. I got to worry about putting food on the table. And you know, I don't need to deal with this particular pain right now. Let's just kick the can down the road. That attitude, that response to the problem, actually sells pretty well. And it's what the oil companies and the coal companies and the natural gas companies play upon, is precisely that reaction, right? The idea that we're going to suffer now if we do something about the problem, that's music to the ears of the fossil fuel firms, because that's the message they want us to hear. Right? And when environmentalists repeat that message, they're playing their opponent's game. Right? So that's a prelude to what I want to discuss with you today. I want to discuss two particular ways in which we in the present generation can benefit here and now from climate policy. And the first has to do with public health. It's what sometimes are called the air quality co-benefits of climate policy. So when we burn fossil fuels, when we burn coal, oil, and natural gas, we're not only emitting CO2, carbon dioxide, which is the main gas responsible for global warming, but also a host of other pollutants that are actually bad for people here and now, bad for the people who breathe them. CO2 doesn't make you sick. This other stuff makes you sick. It can make you really sick. In fact, it can kill you. In fact, in the United States, according to a 2009 study by the National Academy of Sciences, about 20,000 people every year die prematurely as a result of breathing co-pollutants generated in fossil fuel combustion, these various things. What are they? Particulate matter is probably killer number one. These are fine particles that get breathed into the lungs. Sulfur dioxide is another one, nitrogen oxides, and then there are a slew of other air toxics, many of them volatile like benzene. These are nasty, poisonous things, and people who breathe them experience health effects that impact their likelihood of getting asthma, impact the cognitive development, neurological development of infants and children, impact not only respiratory systems but also cardiovascular system, increase the rate of stroke, etc. These are health hazards to which we're exposed, even in the United States, which is a country with relatively good air quality regulation compared to many places in the world. I've just returned from living this spring for 4 months in Delhi, which is the most polluted major city in the world. And the health benefits of reducing the use of fossil fuels in and around Delhi would be absolutely enormous, but they're even substantial here in the United States. Was that the slide I was just showing you, or am I looking on a different one there? Okay. So why do co-benefits matter? Why bring these into the discussion of climate policy? They're typically in a different box. The people who work on air quality are in one box, and the people who work on climate change are in another box, and they don't really talk to each other, even though to a substantial extent they're talking about the same thing, which is the environmental problems generated by burning fossil fuels. And if you do something about one, you're going to probably do something about the other. If you reduce your fossil fuel consumption, you're going to achieve both types of benefits. So why bring the co-benefits into the picture? One reason is that the magnitude of the co-benefits is large. Now, there are a slew of studies out there, and they engage in what is, in many respects, controversial practice, to put it mildly, which is trying to put dollar values on protecting public health and protecting the environment. And the methods that are used to put these dollar values on are debatable, and I don't necessarily want to defend the methods. But what I do want to bring out is that when you look at the studies that have looked at the health benefits of reducing fossil fuel combustion, and the dollar values put on those, which are mainly based on averted mortality, on the so-called value of the statistical life, which in the United States is about $7 million for a person, right, to prevent a person's premature death. That's worth $7 million in this value. This is the life calculation. When you add up those benefits and look at their magnitude and compare them to the benefits of reducing carbon dioxide emissions that are also estimated by some economists using these things called integrated assessment models, what you find is actually the public health co-benefits of reducing fossil fuel combustion are typically larger than the CO2 reduction benefits. Now, personally, I think the CO2 reduction benefits are wildly underestimated in general, but nevertheless, these are the numbers that the policymakers see. The United States government, for example, has something called the Interagency Working Group on the social cost of carbon, which looks at and comes up with a number. I'm not kidding you, a number, a dollar value that says this is the damage done by 1 ton of carbon dioxide emissions in the United States. This is the damage. And this is the figure we're going to use in public policy making in the United States. So if the Obama administration wants to put forward its clean power rule, for example, it has to persuade skeptics, including at the Office of Management and Budget, that the benefits of the reductions, this social cost of carbon, are worth the costs of the measures that are being implemented, right? So that's a number that's often used. And typically the numbers for the public health co-benefits are not only on the same order of magnitude, but greater, often around double what the CO2 benefits are, according to these studies. So they're large benefits, right? They ought to be part of the story. That immediately leads to the conclusion that if you take those co-benefits into account, you've got a stronger case for cutting carbon emissions and reducing the use of fossil fuels than you would have if you just looked at climate policy. Conversely, you've also got a stronger case for protecting public health than you would if you were ignoring climate policy. These two are mutually supportive goals. The second important reason to look at them, however, is that the magnitude of public health co-benefits from reducing the use of fossil fuels isn't the same across the entire world, or across the entire country, or across every source of pollution emissions. It varies from place to place, right? You'll often hear in discussions of climate policy, oh, carbon is carbon. Doesn't matter where you emit it, doesn't matter what you do. It's all having the same effect on the public, right? Because it's a global public ban. But in the case of co-pollutants, these are localized. They're not global public bans. They come out in specific places, and specific communities are impacted by these pollutants, and the extent to which co-pollutants are coming out, as well as CO2, out of the smokestacks, the tailpipes, etc., varies from pollution source to pollution source. So the damages being done are uneven, right? Therefore, if you take co-pollutants into account, it actually does matter where you get your emissions reductions. It matters how you get your emissions reductions. It's not the case that carbon is carbon no matter what, right? That premise, carbon is carbon no matter what, that underlies global proposals for cap and trade type systems, systems that basically think the efficient thing to do is to have a single price for carbon worldwide, and you get the reductions wherever it's cheapest to get them, right? Well, it turns out the benefits vary a lot from place to place. And once you take those into account, you've got a case for policy designs that recognize that. Let me give you an example. My friend and colleague Manuel Pastor and I did a study a couple of years ago looking at the co-benefits from carbon dioxide emissions reductions in the industrial sector in the United States. And to kind of start that discussion going, we use a comparison of 2 sites in Southern California. Manuel lives in Southern California, so these came from him. The first is an oil refinery in Torrance. Torrance is part of Metro LA, very densely populated area. The second is a power plant outside of Bakersfield, California, in a very sparsely populated area. Both emit roughly the same amount of CO2 every year, about 3 million tons of CO2. So from the standpoint of California's climate policy, if all you were thinking about was CO2, you'd say, hey, it doesn't matter whether we get the emissions reductions in Torrance or in Bakersfield, it's all the same, right? Wherever it's cheaper to reduce the emissions, that's where we should be reducing the emissions. If we set up a cap and trade scheme, they can buy permits from each other. It doesn't matter who has the permits and who pollutes, because it's giving you the same emissions reduction. The picture looks a little bit different when you take into account a couple salient facts. In Torrance, California, the annual particulate matter emissions from the refinery are about 350 tons per year. And the number of people living within a 6-mile radius of that facility is about 800,000. Okay, so that's the amount of one of the most important co-pollutants coming about, and 6-mile radius is basically gives some rough idea of the number of people who are likely to be impacted by that particulate matter. In the case of the power plant, the La Paloma plant, the PM emissions are only 1/7 as much, even though these two facilities emit about the same amount of carbon. They have better, in effect, particulate matter emissions controls at the power plant, and the number of people living within 6 miles is 600. So if you combine these two together, both the intensity of the particulate matter emissions and the number of people exposed, I would suggest that actually it makes a lot of sense to try to make sure you reduce CO2 emissions and the emissions of co-pollutants associated with them at the power plant. At the refinery in Torrance. That deserves higher priority than comparable reductions of carbon dioxide emissions at the power plant. Where you get the reductions matters. What do we know about the people who live within a 6-mile radius of industrial sites like refineries and power plants? It's actually not a random cross-section of the US population, as I think many of you are aware. In general, there tend to be much higher percentages of people of color and low-income people living closer to the power plants, closer to the oil refineries, closer to other major sites of pollution emissions. And this is what the environmental justice movement back in the 1980s lifted up, and subsequently a lot of academic research, to which actually some people in this room have contributed, has substantiated the fact that in general, across the United States, pollution does not fall equally upon all. Many of you will remember the old Bob Marley song, which had the line, "When the rain falls, it don't fall on one man's house." Remember that line? I can't remember which song it is. Anyway, it turns out, basically, we're all in the same boat, right? But when the pollution falls, actually it does fall on certain people's houses and not on other people. We're not all actually in exactly the same boat when it comes to hazardous air pollution. This is from an earlier study that we did at Perry that I think Helen and Grace, you guys may contribute to this, called Justice in the Air, where we look at patterns of disparity, and in this case, this is the difference between the minority share of the people who are at health risk from air toxics emissions and their share of the state's population. So in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Colorado, the difference is greater than 15%. That means that if, say, the percentage of people of color was 25%, their share of the public health impact would be at least 40% in those states when you look at what's happening. And in general, it's a pattern that you see. It varies from not only state to state, but community to community, industrial sector to industrial sector, all of these things. If you're interested, I'd be happy to provide you references that provide you documentation, some of the details. So it's not only a question of protecting public health, it's also actually protecting public health of some of the most vulnerable populations in the country. Some of the people who, in terms of both political power and economic purchasing power, have the least ability to cope with the health impacts of breathing polluted air, the least ability to access the medical system, for example, the least ability to afford air conditioners or air purifiers or holidays in pristine locations, etc. They're the people who are being disproportionately impacted. So it's not only a question of efficiency to take these variations in co-pollutant intensity into account, it's also a question of environmental justice. What kind of implications does it have once we take these air quality co-benefits into account in thinking about climate policy, right? Well, the first, the most obvious one, the one that I mentioned already, is that we have a case for strengthening our emissions reductions targets, right? Above and beyond whatever reductions one can justify in terms of protecting the Earth's climate, one can add in these other immediate public health benefits. That leads to a bigger dollar value in terms of the benefits, and therefore, insofar as it's costly to achieve these benefits, we could and should be willing to bear higher costs. That's what is the most obvious conclusion that follows from it. A second conclusion is that, or recommendation, these are the recommendations that Manuel and I put forward in our study, is that we ought to be monitoring much more carefully levels of co-pollutant emissions. And when we institute a climate policy, as is being done now in the state of California under its Global Warming Solutions Act, we ought to be monitoring what's happening to co-pollutant emissions. If we're achieving a certain level of reduction in carbon dioxide emissions, how much co-pollutant emissions reductions are we achieving? What's the pattern by which they're distributed? And indeed, are there any places in which co-pollutant emissions are actually going up as a result of the policy? Now some people would say, wait a minute, how could co-pollutant emissions go up? If you're cutting down the use of fossil fuels, cutting down CO2 emissions, overall, maybe you'll get bigger reductions some places than others, but how would you get any increases in co-pollutant emissions associated with the implementation of policy? Well, it turns out there are ways that could happen. Let me give you one example. One of the ways that CO2 emissions are being reduced in California and around the world is to, and around the country, is to phase out coal burning electric power generation and bring online natural gas fired generators. Natural gas doesn't emit as much CO2 per BTU of energy as does coal. So it's a way that you can reduce your carbon emissions while still producing electricity. It's an important piece of what's been going on, right? However, the places you burn the coal and the places you burn the natural gas aren't the same places. And often, the coal burning power plants, not always, but often, are sited in relatively sparsely populated areas, fairly distant from urban centers. For example, one of the biggest places for California is actually in the Four Corners area. They ship it in on power lines into Southern California. When you start bringing online natural gas-fired plants, those are often smaller plants that are located in more densely populated urban or peri-urban areas. So in those specific communities where those plants are located, which are not, again, randomly chosen communities, but tend to be the communities that are most vulnerable to the siting of hazardous facilities by virtue of their weakness in terms of political power and purchasing power, in those communities, you can actually see rising levels of pollution exposure as a result of the implementation of the climate policy. So minimally, one ought to be monitoring that and looking for patterns and rectifying them where one sees widening disparities and in particular rising absolute impacts. Thirdly, based on the analysis of where co-pollutant impacts are most severe and which communities are most vulnerable, it's possible to design the policy so that you achieve higher pollution reductions, higher levels of reductions in fossil fuel combustion in high priority zones, in those spatial locations where the co-pollutant impacts are particularly severe. And one can do this even within a policy that involves putting a price on carbon emissions, either by a carbon tax or equivalently, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, by putting a cap on emissions. One can have a tighter cap or a higher tax in the high priority zones to drive bigger emissions reductions in those places where the co-benefits, the air quality public health co-benefits, are going to be larger. This is not rocket science to do. In fact, in Southern California, there's already a cap and trade program for nitrogen oxides and sulfur oxides called the Reclaim program that has 2 zones. And in one zone, there's a tighter cap than another zone, and firms in the priority zone can't buy permits from the low priority zone. And the caps are so different that the price of the permits is 8 times higher in the high priority zone than in the low priority zone. So of course, you're getting more emissions reductions in the high priority zone. That's a way you can actually, even within carbon tax or cap-based system, you can take into account these spatial variations rather than treating all emissions the same regardless of where they occur. Similarly, one can designate high-priority industrial sectors and high-priority facilities. For example, the research that Manuel Pastor and I did found that, in general, petroleum refineries both have higher co-pollutant emissions per ton of carbon dioxide and also look particularly bad from an environmental justice standpoint. Those emissions are particularly concentrated in communities of color and low-income communities. You can designate certain sectors, like petroleum refineries, as high-priority sectors for emissions reductions in the same way that a moment ago I was talking about designating certain spatial areas as high-priority zones. You can have higher taxes or tighter caps for those sectors, or for certain facilities that are identified as high-priority facilities. And finally, and this is a segue into the next piece of what I want to talk with you about, the last piece, one can designate some of the revenues that are obtained by putting a price on carbon emissions, by putting on a carbon tax or imposing a cap. One can capture some of that money, which is called, the phrase I'm going to use for that now is carbon rent, and allocate that back to the communities that are most heavily impacted by emissions of co-pollutants from fossil fuel combustion. One can create what are called community benefit funds. And I'm happy to report that the state of California finally has passed legislation, and it was signed by Governor Brown last year. It was previously passed and vetoed by Schwarzenegger, to create community benefit funds as part of its Global Warming Solutions Act, taking some of the revenues generated from California's cap and trade program, where the permits are auctioned off, not given away to polluters, something I'll be talking about more in a minute. And part of that money is cycled into these communities for various projects designed to improve public and environmental health. That seems to us to be another important implication once we take into account the air pollution landscape associated with fossil fuel combustion. Now I want to move into the second arena, which I think you might have read about a little bit already in the Institute. Let me find out that. Did you read about cap and dividend? Was that on the reading? That sounds familiar to people? Talked about a little bit. Okay, so this is where I'm going here. I'm talking about carbon rent. So when we pump CO2 into the atmosphere fills up, right? It's a congestion problem. And actually, we're very familiar with congestion problems, and we know how to deal with congestion problems. So, a common congestion problem is parking space, right? And we deal with them by having parking meters. I just found a 2-hour parking meter and put in my 6 quarters and got 2 hours of time. And it's a way to ration access to the publicly owned streets so the streets aren't chock-a-block filled up like that. We also have regulations. We not only have meters where you pay, or parking lots where you pay, but you go into the parking lot, there are those little white lines, and you got to park between the lines. You can't park where the cars are supposed to drive, etc. So, making people pay and having regulations are not like mutually exclusive. In fact, they typically go together, right? So, one way to deal with congestion problems, an important part of the way to deal with them, is actually to charge for using the scarce resource, the scarce parking space, right? And charging for parking, I want to underscore, doesn't mean that the parking lot's for sale. It just means that people can't use the parking lot for free. It means that the parking lot, if it belongs to the public, is not freely available to anyone who wants to fill it up. But those who use it have to pay for it, right? It means use of the lot. It's not free. Pricing carbon is like pricing the atmospheric parking lot for CO2 emissions, right? It's making it not free, right? Doesn't mean that you're selling off the sky. It means you're not letting people access the sky for free. But the real question that we're going to be talking about is, where does the money then go? First, let me say why I think carbon pricing, raising the price of fossil fuels to limit demand, limit consumption of those fuels, is an important part of the solution to climate policy. One is that in the short run, that's the way you're going to get emissions reductions, is make fossil fuels more expensive, right? That's what's going to drive it, right? You can try to do other things. You can build mass transit systems. You can install, build out renewable energy, et cetera, et cetera. But all that stuff that's operated on the supply side takes time. And the way you get immediate reductions is you make this stuff more expensive. We know that. Secondly, if you make it more expensive, you're creating the incentives for those investments in renewable energy, energy efficiency, mass transit, etc., that drive investment towards a clean energy future. In the United States, about 75% is private investment, 25% is public. Private investment is very responsive to prices and anticipated prices. Even public investment, it turns out, is responsive, right? Whether your local school system decides to invest more in building insulation or renewable energy partly depends on how much they think it's going to cost to stick with heating oil or whatever electricity they've been using in the past, right? So to drive forward those other investments, which are important in the long run, the price is really important. And the last reason, and the one that is probably least discussed, but in my view terribly politically important, is that the carbon rent that you get by putting a tax or a cap on carbon emissions creates opportunities for allocating that rent in ways that can be beneficial to the majority of the people. We've already mentioned one of those ways, which is community benefit funds for some of the most heavily impacted communities. That's one immediate positive use of carbon rent, but I'm going to suggest there's some other opportunities as well. Now I'm going to get a little techie on you for a minute just to show you a couple slides, but if you guys understand this stuff, you're going to understand climate policy better than practically any current member of the U.S. Congress. Most of them don't understand what we're about to go through, right? So what happens when you put a price on carbon? What's the difference between a cap and a tax? A lot of energy is still fighting over whether a cap is better or a tax is better. In my view, actually, it's kind of a misplaced battle because basically they're the same thing. So here's a typical graph from an economics book. This is the demand for fossil fuels. As the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. And here's the supply. As the price goes up, the amount supplied goes up. Notice that the demand curve is really steep. That's because demand for fossil fuels is what's called inelastic. People need those fossil fuels, so it takes a big price increase to get a relatively modest reduction in the quantity demanded, at least in the short run. And when you put a cap on the amount of carbon emissions, as is proposed in various legislations, and California actually has a cap as part of its Global Warming Solutions Act, it limits the total amount of fossil fuels that are allowed to enter the economy. What that does is it reduces the supply, right? It pushes back the supply. And what happens when you cut supply? The price goes up. It's what OPEC does when it wants to make more money. It cuts back supply of oil, and the price goes up more than they cut back supply because demand is inelastic, and they come out ahead. They make money on it, right? So you put a cap, it raises the price. Equivalently, you can just have a tax, right? The tax would be this amount here. And that's another way of cutting back on demand, making this stuff more expensive. And they're basically the same thing. A cap and a tax are basically the same thing, right? Yet it's remarkable. People who are in favor of carbon taxes tend to be really critical of caps. People who are in favor of caps tend to be really critical of taxes. It's like they do battle. But in fact, they basically are doing the same thing. They're raising the price. Yeah, you had a question.
Is the difference in where the money goes?
Well, that's what we're going to come to, is where the money goes. Yeah, because one of the reasons why a lot of people prefer a tax to a cap is precisely related to that. The tax, people think of a tax and think, oh, that means the money's going to go to the government, right? And maybe the government will do something good with it, right? Whereas with a cap, the way that the cap proposals have been laid out in the United States has typically been what's called cap and trade, where, as we'll talk about in a minute, what that really is cap and giveaway and trade. You give away the permits for free to the polluters, the prices go up, right? Just because you give the permits away doesn't mean you're not cutting. You've got a cap, it's limiting supply, it's pushing up the price, right? Pay a tax, right? They may be the initial payers, but that becomes, for those firms, part of the cost of doing business, and they pass that cost along to the consumer. And ultimately, consumers pay in proportion to their so-called carbon footprints, in proportion to their use of fossil fuels. That's not only a necessary result of capping the supply or taxing the fuels, it's actually desirable because it's precisely those price incentives that then induce firms and individuals, households to make the investments in energy efficiency and alternative energy that are part of that clean energy transition. So consumers pay in proportion to their direct and indirect use of fossil fuels. By direct, I mean when you put gas in your car. By indirect, I mean when you go buy a bag of carrots in the grocery store, there are fossil fuels used in producing and distributing those carrots as well. All prices go up, and consumers pay both the direct and indirect costs associated with fossil fuel use. In absolute terms, the richer households pay more than the poor households. Why is that? Because rich people consume more, right? That's part of what it means to be rich, is you consume more stuff. You have bigger houses. They have bigger houses. They have, gas guzzling cars. Poor people don't even have cars, right? So richer people consume more in general. Richer households in general consume more than poor households. That means they're going to pay more as a result of the higher prices than the poor are. However, as a share of their income, at least in the United States, it'll hit the poor harder than the rich. Why? Because fossil fuels are a necessity, right? And it's hard, and necessities figure bigger in the budgets of low-income households than in the budgets of high-income households. So a tax on carbon emissions, or equivalently a cap on carbon emissions, is what economists call a regressive tax. It hits the poor harder than the rich as a percentage of their income, right? Even though in absolute terms, in dollar amounts, the richer pay more, the percentage of their income that's getting paid out is less than it is for the low-income households, right? Now, let me scroll back and just fill in one little historical anecdote here that you may or may not remember. Back when the Waxman-Markey bill was being debated in the late 2000s, during the first Obama administration, you may recall that bill passed the House on a straight party line vote. Speaker Boehner, the Republican Speaker of the House, denounced the legislation and said this is going to be the biggest tax increase on working Americans in history, this cap-and-trade program in the Waxman-Markey bill. And the Democrats said, oh, no, it's not a tax. And it's not going to cost very much, right? It was probably political hyperbole. I don't think it would have been the biggest tax increase. Certainly the initial reduction targets under Waxman-Markey were fairly modest, right? But on some level, Boehner was right, Just because John Boehner says it doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, He was right. It would be like a tax, right? And it would be big. Certainly if it was going to be a price increase big enough to induce the kinds of reductions in fossil fuel use that science tells us we need, an 80% cut by the middle of this century, right? You're talking about substantial price increases for fossil fuels, right? You're talking about gas prices going up to $4, $5, ultimately $10, $15, right? These are the most politically visible prices in the United States. They're advertised on every major street corner across America in numbers 12 inches high. People know the price of gas, right? And those prices are going to go up. They're definitely going to go up. Boehner was right. And when the Democrats said, oh, no, it's not going to go up that much, it's not really a tax, frankly, I think they were either being disingenuous or they were just ignorant. Because one way or another, the prices would go up. Now, what Boehner, of course, wasn't raising was the question of where that money was going to go, which is what we're going to get into now. What kind of price increases are we talking about? Big ones, right? What they call the price elasticity of demand is very low for fossil fuels. So in the short run, at least, you need a 7% reduction. To achieve a 7% reduction in the quantity of fossil fuel use, you need a 23% increase in price. Basically, for every 3% reduction in quantity, you need a 10% increase in price. So you're talking about a 7% reduction in quantity is only the beginning. We're talking about an 80% reduction over time. So we're talking about substantial price increases here, folks. And anybody who tries to tell you different is basically engaged in wishful thinking or trying to delude you, or both, right? Whether they believe it or not is another question, but it's just not true. Putting a price on carbon that is going to be sufficient to achieve the reductions in fossil fuel use that we need to achieve, it's going to involve raising the price substantially. That means there's going to be a lot of carbon rent, right? Now this is the last kind of techie slide I've got, and this one really is kind of, again, if you get this, you'll know something that as far as I can tell, people in Congress don't quite understand. So let me spend a minute explaining this. This is how much emissions we are emitting, right? So we're emitting 100%, that means we haven't reduced them at all, right? 95% means we've cut back 5% of our emissions. What's shown here is a 25% cut in carbon emissions, right? Down to 75% of the current level, right? And this up here, this axis here is measured in dollars. And this red line is what economists call the marginal abatement cost. Now what that basically means is if you had to pay more for fossil fuels, you reduce your use of fossil fuels, how much does it cost you to reduce that use of fossil fuels? To get, to put insulation in your roof, or have more energy efficient transportation, or switch to alternative energy sources. That's the resource cost, right? And as you can see, as you cut emissions more and more, that cost, that extra cost per unit reduction goes up. This is one of the reasons why economists are so fond of the idea of using prices as a way to drive emissions reductions, is you leave it up to people to decide, and businesses how to decide how they're going to cut their emissions. They go for the least cost ways to do it. They get up to the level of the tax, if it's at this level, and beyond that they go ahead and emit because it would cost them more to curb emissions than what they have to pay for that tax or that permit. So this is what's called the resource cost, right? This is how much altogether it costs the economy in order to cut those emissions. And then you see this blue rectangle here, this big blue rectangle? That's not the cost of cutting emissions. That's how much consumers pay for the emissions that are not reduced. That's the tax or the price of the permit multiplied by the 75% of emissions that are still being pumped out there. Right? It's that rectangle. So this is the resource cost. That's a real cost. That's what economists call a cost. You are actually, investing in fiberglass, or you're putting on solar panels or whatever. And this is what economists call a transfer. This red is not spent. It comes out of consumers' pockets, right? But it's not being spent on buying something that somebody had to produce. It's money that's available. It's going to be transferred somewhere. And the question that you posed right at the beginning, is who's going to get that money? Right? How much money are we talking about? Here's some back of envelope calculations. Don't take them to the bank, but this will give you an idea of the ballpark, right? If we implemented such a policy today, and put a fairly modest cap on our emissions of about 6 billion tons, a little bit less than we currently emit, the price would probably be something about $15 a ton, and that would generate about $90 billion a year of revenue, right? Or over that 6-year period, $540 billion. If we then ratchet down the cap, and this is the kind of caps that are discussed under all the cap and trade proposals, etc. In the decade of the 20s, we'd be reducing it to, on average in that decade, about 4.5 billion tons a year. The price would probably go up to $30, maybe more than that. I'm being kind of conservative in estimating here. I'm reckoning that solar is going to get a lot cheaper, etc. Generating about $135 billion a year of revenue, about $1.35 trillion for the decade. In the 2030s, we're cutting down to 50% of the level of the last 5 years of this decade. 3 billion tons, price goes up to $60, about $180 billion a year of revenue. In the 40s, cut further down to 1.5 billion tons. This is really ratcheting down now. Now we're getting down, we're headed down towards that 20% of current levels. Probably up about, again, conservatively, $120 a ton at that point. This is in today's money. Generating again about $180 billion a year. You add it up, and you've got something like $5.5 trillion of carbon rent on the table over the first 35 years of the policy. $5.5 trillion is there's a technical term for this. It's a hell of a lot of money. It's a lot of money. And who's going to get that money, right? This is not an issue that the public is really tuned into very much. It's not even an issue that environmentalists are very much tuned into. Oil companies are tuned into it. You get that back. So where does the money go? This is in the last couple slides. I want to show you, sketch 3 possibilities. Before I get to them, I want to mention one thing. Many of you will have heard this slogan put forward by my friends in the climate justice movement: keep the oil in the soil, keep the coal in the oil. Let's just keep the fossil fuels in the ground, right? Let the people of the Niger Delta rise up and stop Shell and the other oil companies from extracting their oil and polluting their environment. And that's the way to stop global warming, right? Just keep this, just say no, right? What would happen if we did that? What would happen to the price of fossil fuels? It would go up, right? It'd be like putting on a cap. It would reduce supply and push up the price. And where would the money go? Where would the carbon rent go if we did that? Who would get the money for the higher price?
The oil company.
The oil companies and the other fossil fuel producers who aren't keeping their oil in the soil, aren't keeping their coal in the hole, right? They're the ones who would get the money, right? So that's an analysis and a policy prescription coming out of the climate justice movement, which I'm kind of sad to say is not informed by thinking through the basic economics of what would happen if you actually succeeded in doing what you're recommending. Right? The price is going to go up if you keep the oil in the soil. Consumers are going to pay more, and the carbon rent, the extra that they're paying, is going to go to the people who didn't keep their oil in the soil. Right? So who gets the carbon rent? Right? Is it going to be these guys? Some of you may recognize them. Those are the famous Koch brothers, right? Who are major owners of oil and gas interests in the United States. These guys, right? The people who don't keep their oil in the soil, right? Who gets the money is not only an economic issue, it's a political issue, right? Because money talks, right? Money affects politics. We're not just talking about a policy that would shovel those trillions of dollars of carbon rent into the hands of potentially corporations and rich people. That's going to have political fallout, right? The Koch brothers, of course, famous for their attempt to influence the U.S. political process with their billions. That's a U.S. fighter jet sold to the Saudis. It's one of the things they do with their money. These things have political consequences. Who gets the rent, right? So this is, again, the trillion-dollar question. And there are 3 basic possible answers, right? One is you can have what is typically called cap and trade, but actually should be called cap and giveaway and trade. Why? The whole idea of cap and trade is you give away permits for free to polluters based on their historic levels of pollution, some formula involving that. That's a policy that is sometimes known by the ageist and sexist term grandfathering. I just mentioned that because if you see it, you should know what it means. I became a grandfather in March, so I objected to this term even before that, but now it's like, you call that grandfathering? Giving away that carbon rent to these corporations is grandfathering. It's just, it makes my blood boil. But that's what it is, it's cap and giveaway and trade, right? If you didn't give away the permits, you wouldn't have to have trading, right? The only reason there's trading, the only reason trade is part of a cap is that you've distributed the permits for free to polluters, and some turned out, well, they can cut their emissions more cheaply than others, and so they create a market and sell the permits, right? Because people who need the permits and then aren't necessarily the same ones who got them for free. That's why you have cap and trade. It's cap and giveaway and trade. If you don't give away the permits, if instead you auction them off, you don't need to have trades. You can have cap and no trade, right? So when you have cap and giveaway and trade, the free permits lead to windfall profits for those who get the permits. The profits are distributed in proportion amongst households in proportion to their ownership of corporate stock. We know that that's very unequally distributed. And some of the profits actually flow out of the jurisdiction, out of the country, if we're talking about U.S. policy, because some of the corporations and stockholders are foreigners, right? That's cap and giveaway and trade. This has been the dominant approach of the Democrats, right? Cap and trade. Why? I think politically, they made the calculation, which was, to my mind, both odious and actually stupid. That if you had cap and giveaway and trade as the major component of what you're going to do with the carbon rent, you would be able to buy in support from the fossil fuel companies, because you'd be dangling these windfall profits in front of them. Say, well, we're going to phase out fossil fuels, but we're going to give you these free permits, and you're going to be able to get all that money. And the American people, don't worry about them. They're asleep. They won't know what's going on. I don't believe it's true. I think when you see the prices go up at the pump, the American people would react, and whoever voted in such a policy would get voted out, in the next election. But this was the calculation, right? The reason I said it was stupid was that in the end, you can't buy support from the fossil fuel companies, right? They want to protect those assets above all. If there's going to be a policy, they'd rather have cap and giveaway and trade than anything else. But their first best option is no policy at all. So they bargain over the terms of the policy, but then in the end, their lobby money goes into defeating the policy altogether, rather than getting the one that's been weakened by their interests. Second policy is what I'd call cap and spend. In this case, the permits are auctioned. They're not given away. So this is like carbon tax, same kind of thing. The money goes to the government, right? This is, again, something that's already done. The money's retained by the government, and the funds are used to increase spending or cut taxes or both. When I say this is already done, this is what happens under RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the northeastern states, which has been operative now since 2009. It's only for carbon emissions from power plants, so it's sector specific. But that's an important sector. It's one of the reasons why, Massachusetts actually, Obama's clean energy plan has weaker targets than the targets here in Massachusetts, right? For Massachusetts, it's no problem to comply with this plan, because we've already got a policy, and part of it's been RGGI, right? And what we do is we auction these permits. There's a quarterly auction that's very easy to do. The power plants bid for the permits. If they need more permits the next quarter, they come back for more. If they have more than they need, they can hang on to them and use them later, right? They can't, I don't think there's trading. You certainly don't need to have trading, because buy what you need at the auction, right? You use them eventually. How people feel about cap and spend partly depends on how they feel about the government. Right? This is McCain and Lieberman, who were the authors of one of the cap and spend or cap and trade bills, which had both a cap and giveaway and a cap and spend component in it. You can have part of the revenues being permits being issued in both ways, giveaways and auctions. And the question is, how will these guys decide how to spend the money? Right? A funny thing about cap and spend is that, in general, this is what liberal environmentalists really like. They like the idea of the government keeping the money. They like it better than the last option I'm going to discuss with you in a second, because they think, well, then we can get the government to spend it on good works. Well, whether they spend it on good works or not partly depends on what these guys decide they want to spend it on. It's an odd thing in American politics. Liberals kind of really like the government in theory, but don't like what the government does in practice. Republicans and conservatives really don't like the government in theory, but kind of like what it does in practice. Spend it on defense, prisons, and stuff. So personally, I think cap and spend, it's kind of like a Rorschach test. What do you see when you see the government? When I see the government, I think of these guys. Economists really like the cap and spend alternative, not because it gives revenues for the Pentagon or something, but because you could use it to finance cuts in other taxes that they call distortionary taxes, income taxes, sales taxes, right? In the case of income tax, at least, that's a progressive tax. You're replacing it with a regressive tax on fossil fuels. But nevertheless, economists like it because they think that those taxes on income and on sales create distortions in the economy. They make it, here's an easy way to think about it, right? They think that American workers don't work as much as they would and should because they have to give part of their income to the government, right? It's like their effective wage is lower than their nominal wage, right? So if you cut income taxes, people are going to be willing to work more, and output's going to go up, right? Wow, what a great story, right? Most economists believe this. I'm not kidding. Environmental economists, they believe it's like mother's milk. They're taught it in graduate school. It's called the double dividend hypothesis. The first payoff is you reduce the externality, in this case carbon emissions, and the second is you cut these distortionary taxes. Would national income output go up if you cut income taxes? Well, labor supply would go up, right? People would be willing to work more. But would they all get jobs? Well, no, because there's this little problem, this fly in the ointment, it's called unemployment, right? We actually live in a world where most of the time there's unemployment. Most of the time, what that means is there are people who want jobs and can't get them. That's what unemployment means, right? That means that there is labor supply over here and there's labor demand over here, and there's more supply than there is demand, right? So if you increase the supply by cutting income taxes, you're actually not going to increase employment and output. You're just going to increase measured unemployment. That's what you're going to get out of it, right? But nevertheless, this is something that's very popular in the eyes of economists. Note the implicit assumptions, right? That first of all, the assumption is that we work too little, not too much. And second, that we have full employment of labor and capital. Neither is self-evident. Last option, and here's where I'll stop, is what's called cap and dividend. Under cap and dividend, the permits are again auctioned, or in the case of a tax, euphemistically sometimes called a fee, the money's collected by the government. And the money is recycled to the people as equal per capita dividends, equal amounts for every man, woman, and child, right? On the principle that we all own in equal and common measure our country's share of the limited carbon absorptive capacity of the atmosphere. What this would do is protect the purchasing power of working families. Why? Because, as I've already mentioned, the poor and the working class, and indeed the middle class, have smaller carbon footprints than the rich. Everybody pays in according to the size of their carbon footprint. Everybody gets out according to their use of, according to their common ownership of the resource. So the amount of money that one gets back doesn't depend on how much fossil fuel you consume. It depends on how much fossil fuel everybody consumes. You get back your equal share of that money. It's an example of what economists sometimes call a fee-based scheme. Let me give you an easier example, perhaps, to get your head around. I'm told that out in Silicon Valley, there are companies like Google, maybe, that have office buildings with, say, 1,000 people working in them, and they've got a parking lot that accommodates 500 vehicles. And the problem is, if everybody drove to work in a single occupancy vehicle, there wouldn't be enough parking space. So what do? Well, they have a price to park, right? They collect revenue for the parking space, because building more parking space would be really expensive in Silicon Valley. So they charge money. And at the end of the month, all the money that's collected gets distributed equally to every person who works in that building. Everyone who's entitled to use the parking space, if they pay, gets back the money that's been collected. So the person who takes public transportation or bikes or walks to work gets back their share of the money and doesn't pay a cent. The person who carpools to work maybe breaks even, and the person who drives in a single occupancy vehicle pays more than they get back. That's called a fee-based scheme. Fees according to use of a scarce resource, rebates according to common ownership of that resource. What cap and dividend is in effect a fee-based scheme applied to the atmospheric parking lot for carbon emissions. And the analogy to the people who take public transportation or carpool to work are the people who have smaller carbon footprints, who tend to be the lower income people. They're the ones who come out most ahead in such a policy. Is this a difficult thing to do? Actually, I discovered recently after making these slides, Switzerland already does it. They've already got a cap and dividend system for carbon emissions in Switzerland. They call them eco-bonuses. I've never met anybody in the United States who's ever heard of them, but they've got it already in Switzerland. A US example of something similar, though not exactly the same, is the Alaska Permanent Fund. So let me say a few words about that and then I'll stop. The Alaska Permanent Fund was established by Jay Hammond, who was a Republican governor. When Alaska started pumping oil from the North Slope, Hammond said, well, this oil belongs to all the people of Alaska, current and future generations. We're going to charge a royalty for every barrel of oil that's extracted in Alaska, and we're going to put it in this thing we call the Permanent Fund, and part of that's going to be used for infrastructure investments, part of it's going to be saved and invested in markets, financial markets, so that future generations of Alaska will still have money even after the oil's gone, because the oil belongs to them too. And part of it's going to be used up to pay out an annual dividend equal per capita to every man, woman, and child in the state of Alaska. That dividend is usually between $1,000 and $2,000 per person per year. Well, for rich people, that's like a nice shopping trip down to Seattle or San Francisco. But for poor people in Alaska, $1,000 to $2,000 per person is a lot of money. The average American for a Native American family of 4 in the United States, last time I looked, was $7,000 a year. And there are a lot of Native Americans in Alaska. So, the Alaska Permanent Fund money could potentially double their annual income. Needless to say, this is an extremely popular policy in Alaska among Republicans and Democrats. It was a Republican governor. The biggest payout was under Governor Sarah Palin, who trumpeted the payout, right? Because oil prices were high and they had a lot of royalties then. This is really popular. If you've never done it, it's worth 5 minutes. Go to the website of the Alaska Permanent Fund and look at the form you fill out to register for your dividend. All you have to do is provide evidence that you live in the state of Alaska. It's a 1-page or 2-page form. It takes probably 5 or 10 minutes to fill out. You mail it in, and you get the check in the mail. Right? Actually, normally you get an electronic transfer into your bank account because that's cheaper than using paper in the mail. Right? We already do it, distributing dividends. Look, if Alaska can do this, we can do it, right? The main difference is that, of course, their revenue is coming from pumping the oil, right? So Alaskans want to pump, a lot of them want to pump more oil because they get more revenue. Whereas with a cap on carbon emissions or a tax, the tighter the cap or the higher the tax, the less the fossil fuel we burn, the bigger the payoff. Why? Because the price goes up faster than the quantity of permits goes down, right? Because of that inelastic demand. So once you get a system like this going in the United States or any other country or jurisdiction, people are going to have an incentive to want a tighter cap or a higher tax because that's actually going to increase the payoff, right? This is from the website of the Alaska Permanent Fund. That's from the Anchorage Daily News. They made a graph of it. So there's the big payout under Sarah Palin, over $2,000. This is doable. What cap and dividend is founded upon is an underlying principle which I would suggest to you is widely shared, not only amongst Americans across all different constituencies, but indeed widely shared amongst the people of the world. And the principle is that, and it's expressed in the mural, this logo that Diego Rivera wrote on this mural that I once saw in Mexico City, which says, "The earth belongs to us all, like the air, the water, and the light and heat of the sun." That's Diego Rivera's own spelling there, right? I think that's a widely held principle, right? And cap and dividend is a way of implementing that principle when it comes to use of the Earth's scarce capacity to absorb carbon. I think it's got deep, wide philosophical appeal, but also, and for me that's really important, but also it's really important, I think, the political durability of such a policy. Because as the price of fossil fuels goes up, what is going to prevent the backlash from the public that says, wait a minute, I've already got bills to pay. Now you're jacking up the price of gasoline. I got to drive to work, and now it's costing me more. They're picking my pocket again. Them meaning the government, the corporations, all the people who are out to get the little guy. Right? What's going to prevent that reaction if and when we start to see a serious implementation of climate policy in the United States? And I would submit to you that the best way to head that off is to have the carbon rent recycled to the people in a clear and transparent fashion, very visible, and in a way that people perceive as fair. I don't think cap and giveaway and trade is politically viable over the long run, right? Now, I'll close with this. This anecdote. During the battle over Waxman Markey, I was on a conference call with some enviro types and philanthropic types, right? And they were trying to enlist support or discuss what was called the Cantwell-Collins bill, which was a cap and dividend bill submitted by Senators Maria Cantwell and Susan Collins in 2009 in the Senate. The only bipartisan bill, last bipartisan bill ever tabled in the US legislature, in fact. It was 75%, all the permits auctioned, 75% of the revenue back to the public as dividends, 25% for clean energy investments, public investments. That was their bill. And the people on the call who were Waxman-Markey proponents said, oh, that'll never pass, that's politically unrealistic. And I said, well, why? And they said, because the oil companies and the fossil fuel companies will never let it pass, they'll never support it. You know, they want cap and trade, i.e. cap and giveaway trade, for the reasons I just made explicit. And I said, well, you know, what about, you know, the American people, right? What about, you know, how they will react to this policy? And they said, what matters for getting it through the Congress is not the American people. What matters is the corporate lobbyists. And I said, well, let us assume a democracy. There's this joke about economists, let us consume a camel. It's an illusion. I said, let us assume a democracy. And they reacted just like you folks did. They just laughed. They thought that was hilarious. Let us assume a democracy. Wow, this guy's an Ivy Tower academic. Listen to him. You know? I hate to tell you folks, that's what it's going to take. It's going to take a democracy to get that kind of legislation. Right? It's not just going to happen because politicians in Washington say, oh, gee, this is a good idea. We can, you know, we can deal with climate and actually keep our constituents whole, you know. It's going to happen because of public pressure. Right? When that public pressure comes, I think you can get bipartisan support for this legislation, Republicans and Democrats. I think you can do it. Because it's not in big government. It's giving the money back to the people, right? I think it potentially crosses party lines. But the only way it'll happen is if people around the country stand up and demand it. Right? That's the only way, actually, pretty much any big changes happen. Right? So that's, I think, what we got to do. So recapping, climate policy is not just about people versus the planet. It's not just about the current generation versus future generations. It's also about the distribution of rights, income, and health within the current generation. And foregrounding that set of questions seems to me to be critical to breaking the logjam, which has so far prevented us from getting an effective climate policy in the United States. I'll stop there. Sorry I went on.